With us now, the director of Cast Clay YWCA, Aaron Prock. Now, Aaron, thanks for being here. Obviously, an interesting case that took place last week. I don't want to touch on that, but I do want to touch on this. We live in sort of, sometimes I think, a bubble here in the Valley. Everything seems to be going well. The economy's good and whatnot. So people don't think that this is really prevalent, meaning domestic abuse. How prevalent is it in our Red River Valley right here at home?
You know, in 2012, we at the YWCA Emergency Shelter sheltered more people last year than ever before in our history. We provided nearly 25,000 nights of shelter to women and children, over capacity 72% of the time last year, and served a record number of children. And so, you know, what I would say is that the reality speaks in its numbers and those that we served last year. 68% of those came to us because of some sort of violence in their life.
And so how many people can you house? And when you say over capacity, what's capacity at the YWCA?
Our capacity here at the largest emergency shelter in the state for women and children, 65 women and children. That capacity, sometimes we're able to exceed that capacity because we turn rooms that are otherwise used for common spaces, like coffee lounges and libraries, into bedrooms and drag some mattresses in and that kind of thing, to try and meet that increased need.
One of the things I think that really jumped out to me in the case that took place last week was how often it occurred with the same woman. And I think from what I hear, that's sort of a pattern in a lot of domestic abuse situations. Help people understand why it's so tough for a woman just to basically walk out the door and say bye. You know,
abusers work very hard to keep their victims in their control. And on average, a woman leaves 7 times before she finally takes that final exit and moves on and works on being independent again in her own life. And people often say, why doesn't someone leave? You know, the answer to that is really difficult, and there's many different reasons why women doesn't leave. But I think a better question is, why are people abusing women and children? Why is it happening in the first place, and why are we tolerating that women and children are being abused? And so places like the YWCA work with women every day, and we see that fear in their face. We see them being fearful of failure. You know, marriage is this thing in our society where people want to be successful at it. And maybe it's for religious reasons they don't leave, and that marriage is a taboo thing. Or they fear for their lives. We often see women fearing for their lives. And I think, you know, you and I were discussing earlier, I think people don't understand what happens behind closed doors. After the white picket fence and hanging out and picnicking with your friends, what happens in people's homes, and it's tough to judge.
I love how you reframed it. So why is this happening? Why is society allowing this to go on? What's your answer to that question?
You know, I think that we're private by nature in our area of the country specifically, and want to mind our own business to the best we can. But I think on issues like this, it's our duty and our job to stand up and say, we've had enough. And so if you're seeing controlling behaviors, and sometimes you don't get to see it, but this is happening to people in our community each and every day. We're seeing, like I said, record numbers of women and children coming and seeking the support and sheltering embrace of the YWCA. And we found that our mission of empowering women is helping women lift back up and know that there are resources. And I think also to help people understand that they're worth it. That power and control wheel and this cycle of violence is just that. There's 3 phases of it. It's, you know, this escalating stage, and then some sort of incident finally happens, and then there's a honeymooning phase. The most dangerous time for a woman in a relationship is when she does finally try to leave, because she's either been threatened or she's fearful of what will happen and what those consequences will be.
You know, you mentioned that here in the Valley, we're very private. People like to think, hey, my business is my business, not yours. But I think people kind of go through this challenge, if you will, where it's like, hey, look, I hear somebody that might be being domestically abused, or I've seen this, but I don't really know if it's my job to step in. If there's a neighbor or a friend or a family member that knows what's going on, how can they support this woman to get out of this relationship and go and rebuild their lives?
Well, if you're witnessing an incident of domestic violence in your community, it is a crime. It is a pervasive, life-threatening crime, and it can be prosecuted, and you should call the police. That's the first step. If you are working with a coworker and you're seeing some of the signs that maybe you think something's going on, I'd encourage you to talk with them about it and say, there are resources available. This is not your fault, number one. And number two, there are places that can help you.
But if I call the police, aren't I putting possibly this woman at more risk? Because if the police show up and they both deny it, and all of a sudden that police leave and...
So what happens if you do nothing?
Well, I understand me sitting down and talking to the person. That I definitely get. But is the first step you're saying to call the police, or is there?
I think if there is an active domestic violence case happening right in front of you, you need to call local authorities and say, we need help in our neighborhood, just like you would if there were a fire or a kid getting hit by a bike.
That I definitely agree. So
absolutely.
Utopian point of view here, magic wand. How do we eradicate women being abused?
We don't tolerate abusers.
See, for me, I look at it and I go, this is a men thing. I mean, if we're going to stop it, the men need to step up and go, you know what, this isn't right. And I don't see a lot of men calling each other out. So I understand we need to stop it. But I guess on the other side of it, is there a place where men or something society can do to, okay, guys, enough's enough. Like, you got to stop this. This doesn't make you a man by going beating up a woman.
You know, in men are victims of domestic violence as well. And so, you know, granted, the statistics on that are heavily skewed, there's no question about it, but I think it's in everyone's problem. It's in all of our best interest to make sure that our society continues to thrive and grow by being polite to each other, by treating each other with respect and dignity, and knowing that there are options available if you see things like this happening. You know, I read a study earlier today, Chris, in the Journal of Women's Health that was passed on to me by someone in our network that was done at the University of Iowa, talking about the rural disparity in domestic violence. In that, of the study, they surveyed over 1,400 women in small and isolated areas, and intimate partner violence in those areas, based on their study, was at a much higher rate than it is in urban areas. And in fact, it was 22.5% of those surveyed had reported that they had been a victim of intimate partner violence in the last year.
Wow.
Right. And that they were 3 times greater than urban women to have a site that's available to them, such as the YWCA or the Rape and Abuse Crisis Center, where there's resources for help. And of that, 25% of them lived more than 40 miles away from a place that could help them in these rural areas.
What do you attribute the higher prevalency to, though?
Isolation. I think, no question, there aren't neighbors that are seeing and witnessing what's happening. The transportation barriers that take place, if they only have one car, can't access the bus and public transportation. Those are things that aren't available, but definitely being in a secluded area.
Erin, thanks so much for being here.
Appreciate thanks for
it
having
very
me.
much. And
thanks for having me.
Let us know how you feel about the situation. Obviously, it is a touchy thing, but I think it can be a problem for everyone that needs to solve it, and it definitely, obviously, needs to stop. Let us know how you feel about it. Go to our website, 630pov.com. There you can email us and text us. We'll be right back with some of your comments.